Okay, today I'm going to talk a little bit about a brain neurotransmitter. What is a brain neurotransmitter? A neurotransmitter, as the name implies, transmits nerve messages in the brain. There are several of them: acetylcholine, there's norepinephrine, there's GABA-aminobutyric acid, GABA. But the one I want to talk about today is called dopamine. Dopamine is it's a lot more popular than people know about, and you'll see why in a minute. It's a brain neurotransmitter. It's produced in the nuclear accumbens section of the brain in cells called the substantia nigra, and it's produced from the amino acid L-tyrosine. L-tyrosine is not an essential amino acid because it can be synthesized in the body from the essential amino acid phenylalanine. So you need either phenylalanine or tyrosine to manufacture or synthesize dopamine in the brain, and it's called an enzyme called tyrosine hydroxylase. And again, I don't want to get into biochemistry here, but it's not very hard for the brain to convert tyrosine into dopamine, but it's tightly controlled. The brain only converts tyrosine into dopamine when there is a need for dopamine. In other words, the brain can sense when there needs to be an upgraded production of dopamine, so it increases tyrosine incorporation into the brain to be used as the raw material for dopamine production. But there are certain conditions, which I'll talk about later, where dopamine can become abnormally elevated and cause problems. Now, what you want to do is you want to elevate dopamine under certain conditions, but you don't want to get it too high. Now, I'm going to get into this now. What is dopamine? Why would you be interested in it? Because dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's involved in feelings of reward. It's involved in memory, it's involved in attention, and it's involved in the regulation of body movement. In other words, anything that makes you feel good, even thinking about it, is going to stimulate the release of dopamine. When dopamine, here's a little flat statement for you. When dopamine is secreted in the brain, you feel good. Your mood is elevated and you feel great. If it gets too high, again, it causes problems. We'll get to that in a minute. You can see with the lack of dopamine, if you want to see what dopamine, not having enough dopamine looks like, look at a person with Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a brain neurodegenerative disease caused by a destruction or lack of activity in those same cells in the brain that produce dopamine. No one really knows the precise cause of Parkinson's disease, but the suspects include environmental toxins and elevated oxidation in the brain, particularly involving an excess amount of the minerals iron and copper. And when iron and copper get in the brain, if they're not attached to proteins, they're very reactive with oxygen. It causes a massive release of what they call free radicals. These free radicals tend to selectively destroy the neurons in the brain that produce dopamine. So that's a major theory of why some people get Parkinson's. There's probably a genetic aspect also, but you know it involves a elevation of a protein called synuclein. I'm not I'm not going to again get into the biology of Parkinson's disease because this video is not about Parkinson's disease. It's about dopamine. Suffice to say that Parkinson's disease is on the rise for probably a number of reasons, maybe having to do with, again, environmental toxins, who knows. Let's see, what was I going to say? Now, you might remember well, who would forget, the great fighter, the man who called himself the greatest, Muhammad Ali. Those of you who followed Ali's career might have noticed when he got older, he kind of slowed down. He was very rigid. He had trouble talking, moving. He never lost his intellectual abilities. It's just that he lost his ability to move freely. Now, interestingly, what Ali had was called Parkinsonism. In other words, it wasn't full-fledged Parkinson's disease, but it affected the same part of the brain that produced dopamine. So Ali didn't produce enough dopamine. This is what caused his symptoms that were quite obvious. An interesting fact about Ali, He was born with an abnormally small nucleus accumbens, the area of the brain that produces dopamine. As such, he was open to damage to that area. And the damage one of the things that can cause damage to that area is blows to the head. And, although Ali was pretty good at ducking punches when he was younger, in the later fights of his career, he got hit quite a bit in the head. This is what probably caused the damage to his nucleus accumbens and led to his subsequent Parkinsonism. The bottom line, as strange as it might sound, is that Ali should never have been a professional boxer because he was at very high risk of causing damage to the nuclear accumbens. Of course, it's great for everybody that he did become a boxer because he was so great, but the bottom line, if he didn't become a professional fighter, he probably would never have gotten Parkinsonism, and he might even still be alive today. But as Ali once said on a television show, he was talking with his frequent opponent, Fraser. I'm sorry, Joe Fraser. And he said to him, Joe, if it wasn't for boxing, both of us would have wound up lifting garbage cans in Louisville, Kentucky. So he had a point there, too. A lack of dopamine also plays a major role in attention deficit disorder. And this explains why drugs such as Adderall, Ritalin, that kind of thing, they boost dopamine in the brain. And that's one of the reasons why they're used to treat ADD. However, these drugs have a lot of side effects too. Adderall is currently being used a lot as a so-called smart drug, which I don't recommend because if it's used extensively and long-term, it will probably cause damage to the part of the brain that produces dopamine, and you could wind up with Parkinson's disease. It's not worth it. There are other ways to increase dopamine, which I'm talking about in this article, and there are safe ways to do it, like the smart nutrients that I discussed in a previous video. I mentioned earlier problems with an excess amount of dopamine in the brain. This could be caused by several things. For example, cocaine. The reason why people get that feeling of being high on cocaine is because cocaine blocks the reuptake of dopamine in the brain. In other words, dopamine is secreted by the neurons, certain neurons in the brain, and then it's destroyed by an enzyme called monoamine oxidase. But when you take cocaine, you block the reuptake of dopamine, therefore causing it to build up in the brain and producing a tremendous euphoric effect, and that's associated with cocaine. However, again, you can get too much dopamine in the brain, and you can get an extremely manic state. And once again, when you elevate dopamine too much on a regular basis, it's going to cause a breakdown of the cells in the brain that produce dopamine. And cocaine is bad for a number of reasons. It also overstimulates the heart. A lot of people don't realize every time you snort a line of cocaine, you cause a little bit of destruction, a little bit of scar tissue forms in the heart. These are called contraction bands. Eventually, with regular use of cocaine, you're going to cause so much scar tissue to form in the heart that you can be walking down the street and wind up with a sudden death heart attack. But again, I don't want to go off on tangent. I don't want to talk about cocaine, but that's one of the things that can elevate dopamine too much. So can methamphetamine. In fact, it's very common among heavy speed users or methamphetamine users to show what looks like schizophrenia, because an excess of dopamine can cause symptoms that look exactly like schizophrenia. Very sadly, this happened to a friend of mine, famous bodybuilder. I'm sure many of you remember this man, Mike Mentzer. For a period of his life, Mike Mentzer was addicted to methamphetamine, and he definitely showed schizophrenia. He had a condition brought on by his methamphetamine use called paranoid schizophrenia. And again, this was caused by an excess of dopamine in his brain being released by his heavy use of methamphetamines. And of course, even people with schizophrenia alone, they tend to, without even using any drugs, they tend to produce a little bit too much dopamine, and this causes them to have symptoms like, where they're walking down the street, they'll be talking to imaginary people, or they hear things that nobody else hears. This again is from too much dopamine. Uh, but remember, on the other hand, when people get off drugs like cocaine and meth, after elevating their dopamine so high, if they get off it cold turkey, they get a sudden tremendous drop in dopamine, and this causes an extreme state of depression where you just don't even want to move. It's called a crash, and this happens very commonly in people that tend to use recreational cocaine. They feel very elevated in the hours they're using it. Soon afterwards, though, they get, like, maybe for about 2 days after they don't use any cocaine, they get a terrible, terrible crash, tremendous depression. You don't want to do anything but lie around. Dopamine is also the neurotransmitter of drive and ambition. In other words, when your dopamine is at a good level, you have a lot of drive, a lot of ambition, a lot of focus. You're motivated to succeed, and you have a feeling of intense energy. It's not hard to understand how an elevated brain dopamine can also aid your training, since you will feel very motivated. You have this energy. You want to go in, you want to train, and you want to train hard. That's why a lot of these pre-workout supplements include dopamine precursors such as tyrosine and others, because it does definitely increase your training motivation and drive. Now, another reason why you want to have a good amount of dopamine is that dopamine is the neurotransmitter that relates to feelings of sexual pleasure. In short, when dopamine levels are high in the brain, you have an increased libido, or you feel very horny. When dopamine levels are high, you have an urge to have sexual relations. And where they're low, it's the opposite. You have no sexual drive. So, again, good reason to raise dopamine. Unfortunately, the reward feeling induced by high dopamine can also lead to addiction and obesity for obvious reasons. In other words, having an elevation of dopamine makes you feel so good, you want to do the thing that makes it happen. In other words, you want to snort cocaine, you want to eat food that you like, because when you eat food that you like, it stimulates a surge of dopamine in the brain, causing you to want to eat even more of that food. That's food addiction. Not good. In fact, dopamine, you could say that dopamine is the neurotransmitter of addiction, because it has a very, very powerful and potent effect on causing you to actually just want to do things that stimulate it. Like I said, when on the other hand, when dopamine levels are low, you're not motivated to do anything. You're not even trained. Your enthusiasm and drive is low. While dopamine levels in the brain are well regulated by enzymes like that Mayo enzyme I talked about, monoamine oxidase, there are times when you want to elevate dopamine levels. Now, I do this myself with certain nutrients that I'll discuss later in this article, and I found that having elevated dopamine levels results in a mild degree of mania. Mania sounds bad. In other words, mania is an extremely elevated mood, but it also entails a tremendous amount of mental energy and focus. And I found it's very useful for creativity and my writing. When my dopamine level is high, I'm very, very motivated to write. I can write for hours, and my focus is intense. So I actually purposely manipulate my dopamine levels in the brain, not by using drugs like cocaine or amphetamine, but by using certain nutrients. And let me tell you, folks, it works every time. It works every time. Now you say, well, what happens if when you want to bring down the dopamine? Very simple. There are other neurotransmitters that oppose dopamine in the brain. One of them is called serotonin. So if I feel my dopamine is too high, or it's high when it shouldn't be, I'll take a nutrient such as tryptophan or 5-HTP, which stimulates serotonin, which modifies the dopamine, brings it down a little, makes me feel okay without feeling manic. One easy way to elevate dopamine. I sound like a manic now, don't I? Well, you know why? I'll tell you why. Because I just had 3 cups of coffee, and I forgot to mention coffee elevates dopamine. So yeah, I'm a little bit manic. It feels good. One way to elevate dopamine is to eat a high-protein diet. As noted, the 2 amino acids, phenylalanine and tyrosine, they're involved in dopamine synthesis, and they can, you will find that tyrosine is awful. Like I said earlier, tyrosine is often included in pre-workout supplements. And again, this is because tyrosine boosts dopamine. If you take tyrosine about an hour, maybe an hour and a half before you work out, It'll be converted by that time in the brain to get through the blood-brain barrier. It'll be converted by tyrosine hydroxylase into dopamine. It'll be there for your workout, and you're going to feel great. You want to feel like working out. You want to push the reps. You're going to be trained hard. You're going to train intensely. If you were to cut tyrosine or phenylalanine out of the diet, you'd lack dopamine. You feel like crap. You're lazy. You just want to lie around. You don't want to do anything. I would bet dollars to donuts that these people with no motivation who lie around, they don't do anything, they have no ambition, they don't want to succeed. I would bet that their brains aren't producing enough dopamine, because that's exactly what happens without dopamine. If you want optimum dopamine levels, you want to limit your intake of saturated fat. As I've discussed in recent videos, saturated fat is controversial. I mean, the old notion about that saturated fat is a direct cause of cardiovascular disease has largely been discounted. However, and I've mentioned this also, in the brain, too much saturated fat has definite, without question, definite negative effects. It's associated with the onset of Alzheimer's disease. I'm talking about an excess of saturated fat. And also, it interferes with the activity of dopamine-producing neurons. So if you want to have optimal dopamine activity, you want to limit saturated fat intake. Now, somebody might raise the question at this point, what about ketogenic diets? They feature a moderate protein, extremely high saturated fat level, often as much as 70 to 85% of calories. Well, the answer there is if you're working out and you're involved in physical activity, you're going to burn off most of that saturated fat, so it doesn't really become a problem in that situation. The saturated fat issue only becomes a problem if you're inactive or sedentary. Then you're going to have an interference with brain neurotransmitters if you eat a lot of saturated fat. And I should also point out that the studies that have shown that saturated fats interfere with dopamine production in the brain have all been done with mice and rats. There's no human verification. However, most neuroscientists think that it also exists in humans, but there is no human. Oh, wait a minute, somebody complained about human. They said I was saying human. Now, doesn't that sound unnatural? Human, or what sounds more natural? Human or human? So I'm going to say human. Anyway, so there's no human research that shows that saturated fat does interfere with dopamine production in the brain. There is also some evidence that dopamine can be produced in other parts of the body. One area where it can be produced is in what they call the intestinal microbiome. The intestinal microbiome consists of trillions of bacteria, fungi, and other organisms that reside in your colon, and they do amazing things in the body. I've written about this in my Applied Metabolics newsletter. 99% of your immune system interacts with your intestinal microbiome, but this is fascinating. Some of the bacteria that exist in your intestinal microbiome can actually independently produce neurotransmitters such as norepinephrine and dopamine that could travel in the blood and get into the brain and affect brain activity. Now, you say to me, well, how can I increase the effectiveness? The way to increase the effectiveness of the intestinal microbiome, the way to increase this type of bacteria is to ensure that you eat prebiotics such as fiber foods, vegetables, fruits, and that kind of thing, and also to take probiotic supplements. Probiotic supplements will likely increase the intestinal bacteria that produce dopamine and will also increase your dopamine levels in a very safe and effective manner. For those of you who want more information about how to use probiotics, the best way to use them and their full effects and whether they actually work, this is all in a huge article I wrote for my June issue of Applied Metabolics. The June issue of Applied Metabolics has a complete guide to prebiotics and probiotics, tells you everything you could possibly need to know about these substances. Now, if you want to get dopamine directly in food, you can't do it. But what you can get is something called L-Dopa. L-Dopa is a kind of amino acid that is a direct precursor for dopamine. And one of the foods that's particularly high in L-Dopa is fava beans, also known as velvet beans, also known as Mucuna pruriens. and it's also found in supplement. You can find it in supplement form, Mucuna pruriens. It contains naturally high levels of L-Dopa. Eating these beans or ingesting a Mucuna supplement can boost dopamine levels in the brain. Indeed, forms of L-Dopa in drug form are used to treat Parkinson's disease, and yet the supplements of Mucuna may work better and last longer than L-Dopa drugs, which stop working for some reason. The body kind of gets used to them. And the Mucuna bean supplements also produce less side effects than the L-Dopa drugs. Most of the supplements that I discussed in my previous Smart Nutrients video, which is available on this channel, the Jerry Brainham channel, most of those nutrients also boost dopamine in a very safe manner. Herbs that can do so include rhodiola. Rhodiola is very effective at boosting dopamine. And there's one called wild oat extract, which is, you could find it, it's kind of a proprietary formula, but there's been about 3 human studies that show that it definitely increases dopamine, and again, in a very safe manner. Exercise itself will boost dopamine levels. That's one of the reasons you feel good. One of the reasons you feel good after a nice workout is because your dopamine levels are elevated. And the higher the intensity level, the higher the dopamine levels. So if you train hard with the weights and you do high intensity interval aerobics, you're going to have a very quite an elevated dopamine level after the workout. And if you, in another trick, if you do ingest some tyrosine, maybe 1,000 milligrams is enough. About an hour before your workout, it'll add to the exercise effect of increasing dopamine in the brain. Again, this is the reason why tyrosine is included in a lot of these pre-workout formulas. One way to lower dopamine is to not get enough sleep, because it lowers the activity of dopamine receptors in the brain. On the other hand, you don't want to boost dopamine at night, because it's a potent brain stimulator, produce a raging case of insomnia. It's, think about it. Cocaine, speed, they work because of elevated dopamine. You don't want to have that when you want to go to sleep. Another easy way to elevate dopamine is to just go out in the sunlight. Sunlight can boost dopamine level. One study of 68 healthy adults found that those who received the most sunlight exposure in the previous 30 days had the highest density of dopamine receptors in the reward and movement regions of the brain. Lying in the sun will increase dopamine. This is the reason why a lot of people are addicted to tanning. They go to these tanning beds because they tell you that, I don't know, it just makes me feel good. Well, the reason it makes them feel good is because it elevates dopamine levels in the brain. But, you're also risking skin cancer. So, like I say, there's better ways to elevate dopamine. A few nutrients play a role in dopamine synthesis besides those 2 amino acids. These nutrients include iron, niacin, folic acid or folate, and vitamin B6 or pyridoxine. Magnesium favors dopamine levels, as does the curcumin or turmeric, and oregano extract is pretty good for elevating dopamine. And green tea elevates dopamine in rats. Probably does so in humans. So that's about it. That's all. I think everything you need to know about dopamine. Dopamine, again, to summarize, it's the feel-good neurotransmitter. When dopamine's high, you feel great. There's nothing like it. That's why people use cocaine and speed. That's why they eat too much. It's all to get that dopamine surge. But now you know how to do it naturally without getting fat and without destroying your brain. Just do it naturally. If you want more, I'm sorry, I'm manic. I apologize. Too much coffee. If you want more information about nutrition, food supplements, exercise science, hormonal therapy, anti-aging research, fat loss techniques that really work, women's health, ergogenic aids, hormonal therapy, subscribe today to my Applied Metabolics newsletter, www.appliedmetabolics.com. 40 to 50 pages every month. No ads, no bullshit, all truth, all evidence-based. It includes not only scientific research, it also includes my 57 years of study and empirical experience that cannot be matched by anyone. None of these other publications on the internet come close. I have more experience than all of them put together, and I'm including everything I've learned in my Applied Metabolics newsletter. Those who subscribe, I will answer short questions to. There's an email portal on the Applied Metabolics site. It's only for subscribers. And I also for subscribers, I have a private Applied Metabolics Facebook page where almost every day I include new studies on nutrition, exercise science, general health, and medicine. All the time, I have discussions on the Facebook page, and anyone can also ask me questions on the. Again, that's only for subscribers to Applied Metabolics. www.appliedmetabolics.com. Subscribe today. And again, by the way, there's another way of elevating dopamine. You're not going to believe this, but it's true. When you get a dog, they've shown in scientific studies, petting a dog actually relaxes you and increases a number of feel-good chemicals in the brain. One of them is dopamine. So just having a dog can elevate dopamine. It does for me. So go to your local shelter, adopt a dog today. There's a lot of loving dogs that are just waiting for you. Take care. Thanks for listening.